Dragons are mythological creatures present in numerous cultures throughout history. Although their characteristics vary by region, they are generally described as powerful beings, often with magical or supernatural abilities. In a broad sense, dragon designates a large mythical creature with reptilian features such as scales, a tail, claws, sometimes wings, and the power to fly or breathe fire. In the medieval West, dragons are usually winged and flaming. In East Asia, they are wingless, serpentine, aquatic creatures associated with rain and fortune. The English term comes from the Greek draco, meaning great serpent. In many ancient cultures, dragons were associated with giant serpents or winged reptiles that embodied forces of nature, chaos, or divinity. These mythical creatures not only aroused fear, but also respect, being seen as symbols of power and mystery. Among the earliest known depictions of dragons are Tiamat and Meshusu from ancient Mesopotamia. Tiamat appears in the Epic of Creation, one of the oldest preserved stories. She is described as a primordial monster, half dragon and half sea serpent, who embodies the salty ocean and the waters of chaos. In the narrative, the young gods rebel against her, and she is finally defeated by Marduk, the god of storms and order. Tiamat's defeat is not only a mythological battle, but also an archetype that would profoundly influence other later traditions. The eternal confrontation between divine order and the chaotic forces of the universe. Marduk's act of defeating her represents how the cosmos is organized out of primordial chaos. On the other hand, Meshusu, also known as Sirius or the Babylonian dragon, is a hybrid creature that decorates the famous Ishtar Gate, one of Babylon's architectural wonders. This mythical dragon has a body covered in scales, feline forelegs, avian hind legs, a long tail, a crest, and a forked tongue. Its figure is not merely decorative. Meshusu was associated with several gods, including Marduk and Nabu, and functioned as a protective guardian of the city and its temples. His monumental presence at the gate symbolized strength, divine power, and protection against both earthly and supernatural enemies. Thus, both Tiamat and Meshusu show how in ancient Mesopotamia, dragons were not simple monsters, but representations laden with cosmic and religious symbolism. They intertwine the idea of primordial chaos and the notion of divine protection and power, laying the foundations for a tradition that would expand and transform into multiple cultures around the world. Throughout history, dragons have appeared in different cultures as versatile symbols, capable of representing both chaos and destruction and wisdom and protection. These creatures, hybrids of serpents, reptiles, and fantastic beasts, became mirrors of the beliefs, fears, and hopes of each civilization. In Greco-Roman culture, dragons and great serpents were linked to the Olympian god's struggle against chaos. One of the earliest myths is that of Python, an enormous serpent that lived in Delphi and was slain by Apollo, thus establishing the power of the god of light and the arts over archaic and telluric forces. Another example is Typhon, a monstrous creature with 100 dragon heads, considered the most fearsome enemy of the gods. He was defeated by Zeus, who buried him under Mount Etna, linking his figure to volcanic eruptions and the fury of the earth. In both cases, the narrative shows how the gods impose order over creatures that embody the wild and the uncontrollable. In the biblical and Christian world, the dragon takes on a much more defined character as a symbol of absolute evil. In the book of Revelation, the Leviathan, a sea dragon representing the primordial chaos of the oceans, and the famous seven-headed dragon, identified with the ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, are mentioned. Here, the image of the dragon is neither ambivalent nor protective, but the physical embodiment of evil, the ultimate enemy of God and humanity. This vision would profoundly influence the medieval European mentality, in which the dragon became almost synonymous with a demon. In medieval and Germanic Europe, dragons are described as large, winged beasts capable of breathing fire, always associated with chaos and destruction. They were not just monsters to be defeated, but tests of courage for heroes and saints. An emblematic example is the legend of Saint George and the Dragon, where a Christian knight rescues a princess and a village terrorized by a dragon. This tale, popularized in the Golden Legend during the Middle Ages, became a metaphor for the struggle of good against evil and for the victory of the Christian faith over barbarism or paganism. From these narratives, the motif of the saint or knight defeating the dragon spread widely in medieval Europe, consolidating the image of the dragon as an enemy of divine order. Medieval bestiaries and tales provide clues as to how people in the Middle Ages imagined the biology of dragons, although they were always mixed with moral and religious symbolism. They mentioned that dragons were the largest of all animals born on earth. A medieval bestiary was a type of book very popular in the Middle Ages, between the 12th and 14th centuries, that described animals, both real and imaginary, with moral, religious, or symbolic significance. In them, they combined science, myth, and religion. They were not zoological treatises in the modern sense. They described familiar animals, lions, elephants, bears, and fantastic creatures, dragons, unicorns, basilisks, griffins. Each animal was explained as a moral or spiritual example. For example, the pelican that opens its breast to feed its young with its blood was seen as a symbol of Christ. They did not seek to teach zoology, but rather to provide moral education and convey Christian teachings through examples from nature. They were teaching tools in monasteries, churches, and courts. They used a literary and allegorical language, accompanied by colorful illustrations of animals, often fantastical or unrealistic. These images are today one of the richest sources for understanding how medieval Europeans imagined creatures like dragons. The dragon in bestiaries appears as the largest and most terrible beast of all, king of reptiles and a direct symbol of the devil and evil. It is described as the enemy of elephants, a way of making it even larger and more imposing. It is said to strangle with its tail, devour with its jaws, and is feared by all animals. Its figure served as a moral lesson. The dragon was the representation of temptation and sin, a spiritual adversary that only Christ could defeat. Thanks to bestiaries, we know that dragons were thought to be able to reproduce like snakes, by laying eggs. Some stories describe them guarding their own nests, although this part was more an extrapolation than a firm tradition. There was also the idea that they were primordial beings, created at the beginning of the world, which reinforced their almost eternal character. There weren't said to be populations of dragons. Rather, they appeared as unique beings, monsters isolated in certain regions. Their size varied depending on the story. Some were described as the size of a winged horse, others as giants capable of encircling mountains or covering cities with their wings. Bestiaries say they could envelop an entire elephant with their body. In European tales, dragons devoured cattle, horses, and people, especially princesses and maidens, the latter loaded with moral and Christian symbolism. They were also said to covet gold and treasure, not to eat them, but to guard them. The gluttonous and greedy dragon represented greed, one of the deadly sins. As for their habitat, they were found in inhospitable and dangerous places, deep caves, inaccessible mountains, or dark lakes and swamps, places far from humans and steeped in mystery. The dragon was part of the landscape of the wild and the uncontrollable, a symbolic boundary between the human world and the unknown. In the medieval mindset, dragons did not have human desires, but rather instincts that represented vices: greed, hoarding riches; gluttony, devouring animals and people; and pride, believing themselves invincible. In Christian tradition, they were linked to the devil, so their desire was summarized as harming, tempting, or destroying. However, in some Germanic or Norse stories, such as that of Fafnir, the dragon also embodied corrupted human ambition, a reminder that the true monster lay within human passions. In the Middle Ages, dragons were exceptional, rare, enormous, and voracious beings, dwellers of mountains and caves, symbolizing evil, greed, and chaos. They were not studied as real animals, but as living metaphors of human sins and fears. However, dragons were not seen as malevolent creatures in all cultures. In East Asia, especially in China, Korea, and Japan, dragons have a benevolent, wise, and protective character. They were considered controllers of rain, rivers, and winds, that is, masters of the natural forces essential to life and agriculture. In China, dragons became an imperial symbol, representing the emperor's celestial power and his ability to guarantee prosperity and balance. Unlike European dragons, Eastern dragons were serpentine and aquatic, and although they lacked wings, they could fly thanks to their magical power. They appeared in celebrations such as dragon dances, not as threats, but as figures of worship and good fortune. In Mesoamerica, the figure of the dragon was translated into the image of the feathered serpent, a sacred symbol that united the terrestrial and celestial. In the Mexican context, Quetzalcoatl was venerated as a creator god, giver of wisdom, fertility, and cosmic order. Its iconography in temples and codices reminds us that, unlike the European dragon, the great serpent here brings knowledge, not destruction. Among the Maya, the same figure is called Kukulkan, a god with attributes of both serpent and bird. At Chichen Itza, during the equinoxes, sunlight projects the famous shadow serpent onto the steps of the El Castillo Pyramid, an architectural astronomical phenomenon that embodies the union of heaven and earth. Although these deities are not dragons in the strict sense of the Eurasian imagination, they serve a similar function. They represent higher cosmic forces, mediators between humanity and the universe. Thus, the dragon does not have a single universal meaning. In some contexts it represents chaos, enemy, and destruction. In others, wisdom, fertility, and prosperity. This diversity reflects the cultural richness of humanity and how the same mythical figure can be transformed according to the worldview of each people. Symbolically, dragons embody a fascinating duality. they can be seen as dark and destructive forces, but also as benevolent guardians and bringers of life. In many Western traditions, dragons represent fire, destruction, and greed. They appear as hoarders of treasure, enemies of divine order, and trials to be overcome by heroes or saints. In this sense, they are the personification of evil or chaos. Beings that symbolize human fears, the temptation of excessive power, and the threat that must be overcome to restore balance. The fire-breathing dragon thus becomes a metaphor for devastation, violence, and the uncontrollable fury of nature. In contrast, in many Eastern cultures, dragons have a radically opposite meaning. There, they are not seen as enemies, but as symbols of water, rain, and fertility. They are credited with the ability to control rivers, seas, and storms, enabling abundant harvests and the prosperity of people. Furthermore, they embody wisdom, power, and celestial authority, becoming imperial emblems in ancient China, where the dragon not only protected the ruler but also legitimized him as a mediator between heaven and earth. These dragons are seen as protectors, wise men, and bringers of good fortune, associated with harmony and cosmic balance. Overall, the dragon is a symbol of extremes. It can represent both threat and the chaos that destroys, as well as the vital energy that fertilizes and protects. Its figure, charged with ambivalence, reminds us that the forces of nature and the universe are always twofold: destructive and creative, dangerous and necessary. Hence, the dragon remains one of the most universal and powerful archetypes in human mythology. Among the main narrative motifs that explain the presence of dragons in myths and legends are three fundamental archetypes that span cultures and eras. First, there is the dragon slayer motif, in which a hero confronts the monstrous creature and, by defeating it, frees a city, a people, or a captive maiden. This tale appears in stories such as that of Saint George and the Dragon in medieval Christian tradition, or that of the hero Siegfried in Germanic mythology. Beyond the epic battle, the narrative symbolizes the victory of good over evil, of order over chaos, and of human courage in the face of the unknown. Another recurring motif is that of the guardian dragon, guarding a treasure, a secret, or forbidden knowledge. This is not a gratuitous monster, but a being placed as a test for those seeking riches, power, or wisdom. Clear examples are the dragon Fafnir, in Norse tradition, who protects his cursed gold, or the dragons of Greek mythology that guard golden apples or sacred sanctuaries. In this case, the figure of the dragon embodies the difficulty of achieving that which is valuable. All treasure, whether material or spiritual, requires sacrifice and courage to be conquered. Finally, there is the archetype of the cosmic dragon, present especially in Eastern and Mesoamerican traditions. These dragons are not enemies, but pillars of the universe, charged with ensuring natural balance and protecting the world's order. In China, dragons are responsible for the rains that make the land fertile and appear as imperial emblems, while in Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, is a symbol of creation, wisdom, and cyclical renewal. Here, the dragon becomes a mediator between the human and the divine, between the earth and the cosmos. In this way, the dragon can be an adversary, guardian, or universal protector. Its narrative function depends on the cultural context, but in all cases it retains its central role as a boundary between the known and the unknown, the accessible and the unattainable. It is very curious that such similar creatures have been described in diverse cultures and at different times, despite the fact that there is no evidence of real biological dragons in the fossil or historical record. However, their persistence in the human imagination has led researchers, anthropologists, and mythologists to propose various theories about the origin of these legends. One of the most accepted explanations is inspiration from prehistoric fossils. In ancient times, when farmers or explorers found the remains of large dinosaurs or mammoths, it was natural for them to interpret those bones as evidence of gigantic monsters. Without a scientific framework to understand them, these bones fueled stories about mythical creatures that lived in ancient times. It is believed that dinosaur fossils were misinterpreted. The giant skulls and vertebrae inspired stories of dragons. In China, dragon bones were ground as medicine. At the beginning of the 20th century, some dragon bones turned out to be dinosaur fossils. Another theory points to the exaggeration of real animals. Crocodiles, giant snakes, Komodo dragons, or even whales may have impressed ancient communities. Oral transmission, with its tendency to magnify the extraordinary, transformed these animals into increasingly fearsome and supernatural fantastical beings. Thus, it is thought that real predators such as crocodiles, large snakes, and monitor lizards, a type of reptile, may have fueled these descriptions. The fire characteristic, for example, has been compared to natural phenomena such as swamp gases, volcanism, or to zoological analogies such as bombardier beetles that expel hot chemical jets, without implying real dragons. There is also a psychological and symbolic explanation. The dragon may represent humanity's universal fears: darkness, natural disasters, death, or the unknown. In this sense, rather than real creatures, dragons are collective archetypes, metaphors for the chaos against which people must fight to build order and meaning in the world. In evolutionary psychology, some proposals suggest that dragons combine traits from the three primary predators of the human lineage: serpent, feline, and raptor, thus fitting into innate fears and spreading as an archetype. Regarding the suggested relationship between dragons' control of rain, rainbows, and rivers, it is thought that they represent a search for representation and understanding of natural phenomena such as lightning and tornadoes. Finally, some scholars point out that the dragon was born from cultural convergence. As people exchanged myths and traditions through trade and migration, images of great serpents, sea monsters, and winged beasts became intertwined, forming a shared symbol that each civilization reinterpreted in its own way. In conclusion, although there is no evidence that dragons ever physically existed, the convergence of stories in so many places around the world shows that these creatures serve a deeper function. They are a reflection of the human imagination and the need to explain the inexplicable, to give face and form to the invisible powers of nature and the cosmos. So, knowing that there is no zoological evidence that dragons have inhabited our world, their nature belongs to the realm of the mythological and cultural, resulting in abundant material and iconographic evidence. Mesopotamian reliefs, monumental gates like the Ishtar Gate in Babylon, Chinese textiles, European sculptures, Mesoamerican codices, and imperial banners. These representations show how different societies imagined great serpents or dragons, attributing to them cosmic, political, or moral functions, guardians of universal order, symbols of a king's power, or images of the dark forces that threaten faith and community. Over the centuries, the dragon transcended temples and religious legends to establish itself in secular literature. In medieval chivalric tales, it resumed its role as guardian of hidden treasures and adversary of knights, as in the tales of Arthurian knights or in the Norse saga of the dragon Fafnir. In modern fantasy literature, writers like Tolkien transformed them into memorable creatures, endowed with personality and voice, such as the greedy Smaug. There, the dragon established itself as an indispensable figure in the imaginary of epic fantasy. But its evolution did not stop there. In more recent works, dragons have taken on wise, enigmatic, and even noble aspects. They became allies or advisors to heroes, guardians of forgotten knowledge, or melancholic beings evoking an older, more mysterious world, populated by natural forces now almost forgotten. This transformation reflects the dragon's ability to adapt to the spirit of each era. From a monster to be vanquished, it became a mirror of humanity, a symbol of power, wisdom, or fragility. Today, the dragon lives on in films, TV series, video games, tattoos, comics, and festive celebrations. It can appear as a terrifying monster that ravages villages, a protective guardian that watches over the righteous, or a majestic being that inspires respect and awe. Ferocious or protective, wise or malevolent, the dragon remains one of the most universal creatures in the human imagination. And perhaps its permanence reveals a profound truth. The most powerful stories are born when human beings give shape to forces greater than themselves, whether to fear them, challenge them, or implore their aid. The dragon, in its many faces, reminds us that imagining is also a way of understanding and making sense of the mystery of the world. The dragon is not just a monster or a god, not even a simple symbol. It is the mirror into which humanity has projected its deepest fears and highest hopes. Wherever humans have felt the chaos of a storm, the fire of a volcano, or the immensity of the sea, they have imagined dragons. Wherever they have sought wisdom, prosperity, or protection, they have also dreamed of them. Their permanence throughout millennia reminds us that, even as cultures change and worlds transform, we still need narratives that confront us with mystery. The dragon lives because it embodies the untamable. Sometimes it threatens, sometimes it guides, but it always inspires wonder. Ultimately, dragons are proof that humankind not only observes reality, it reinvents it. In every fong, every wing, and every scale, beats the certainty that imagining is an act of power. And perhaps that is why, at any time and place, every time someone tells a story, a dragon will be reborn.